Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay, we're finishing up chapter 8. We're talking about when the neshama has to go to has to be taken to the cleaners. So it depends what have to. You come to the cleaners and say, "Well, what did you do with this garment?" So the person who never had any education said, "Well, I didn't do anything with it. I just hung around with my friends." So okay. It's not your fault. You never went to yeshiva. You never learned. So you can't be held responsible for not having learned. But still, all that speech that you had was gift from Hashem, and you didn't use it. So Hashem is all sort of stuffed up with baseball scores and television programs and stuff. So that has to be taken care of with kafakela. Right? The idea of kafakela is that they fling the neshama from one reality to another. They say from one end of the world to the other. They really mean from one reality to the other. So on the one hand, it beholds the reality of its activities. During the 80 years, it was down here in this world. And then on the other, and then it sees it all worthless, meaningless activities, worrying about Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden, and then it flings it back, and it's way up above the clouds. The sun is shining, it's beautiful, you're in a world of truth. And say, yes, this is where I want to be, and then they fling you back to the nonsense again. And in this way, they shake out all the nonsense they shake the neshama free from all the nonsense, like whacking a rug or a blanket before Pesach to get the dust out and any crumbs that might be in there, okay? So that's kafakela. But then there's a person who isn't in this category. The next step is a little more serious. Because this person, he didn't have any alternative. He couldn't have learned because he didn't have any skills whatsoever. He couldn't read Hebrew. He was never taught. He was never exposed to any of the teachings of our sages. So with him, it's not enough kafakela. He's going to get kafakela, yes. But beyond that, since he was educated and he could have learned Torah. Good morning, Ms. Hanabina.
Hi, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, Hannah. So therefore, kafakela alone is not going to help to rid his neshama with its connection with klippus noiga, but it's also going to have a more serious dose, application of chemicals, hot, burning chemicals. That's called, hot burning, spiritual chemicals. That's called Gehinnom. 11 months there cleanses the soul and prepares it to enter Gan Eden. It's not eternal damnation. No, we don't speak about eternal damnation. What happens? You might ask this question. What happens to the butchers and the murderers who persecuted the Jewish people throughout the ages? To the Hitlers and Stalins, Yamach Shemam, who killed millions of people? What happens to them? I don't know.
So is it like the same Gehenna for everybody or only for
No. It depends on who you are and what the cheshbon is. How serious is the nature of the stain? But the neshama is different from the nefesh of a non-Jew, for one thing. And then even in non-Jews, there are many levels and differences depending on what they did with their life. A non-Jew who devotes himself to goodness and following the 7 laws of humanity, which were given at Mount Sinai to the nations of the world through Moshe Rabbeinu, he gets a soul of klippus noiga, like the animal soul of a Jew. And for this, you can get a heavenly reward. Okay, but so if a person has the capability, good morning, Tom. Good morning. If a person has the ability to learn, but doesn't do it, like he has a Shir Gemara on Sunday, and instead he watches the Super Bowl. So it says for this person, not only, now we get to the third level. The Kafakela, page 132, Kafakela alone cannot effectively scour and cleanse his soul. That's what it says. In Kafakela, moil l'nafsho, it doesn't help the neshama lamarka, to cleanse it, ulezachacha, and to purify it. So there's two levels: cleansing, get the dirt out, and lezachacha, to purify it. It should become pure. You know, like you have press. You ever see the olive oil demonstration? Sometimes we do Hanukkah time. So they squeeze the olives. So the olive oil has to be cleansed of all the pieces and so on. But then it has to be further purified. It should become solo, it should be clear, and give a bright, beautiful flame. Okay, so there it is, has severe penalties, it says. This neshama now has to get a more severe penalties than the person who had no possibility of learning. Good morning, Sarah. Had no possibility of learning because he was never educated. This person was educated, didn't take advantage of it, didn't use his education in the service of Hashem. So therefore, he needs kafakela, and he needs Gehinnom. And in Gehinnom, a special category, which is not hot, but which is cold. Because since his negligence of Torah and mitzvahs was through kaltkeit, he was cold, he was indifferent, he was apathetic and indifferent. So his cleansing will be coldness, through coldness, called the purgatory of snow. This was a Gehinnom shel Sheleg. I translate for your sake to the Hebrew. Read the Hebrew words. Gehinnom shel Sheleg. L'kol bittul mitzvahs aseh, for a person who neglects to do the commandments that are possible for him, machmas atzlus, because of laziness. Laziness comes from what? The element of earth, coldness in the animal soul. So therefore, the punishment is also through coldness. Atzlus, beginning shel Sheleg. As explained elsewhere, that is to say, probably in the Zohar. Oh, here we go. Look in the English note here. In the English note, it says, the soul is cleansed in Gehinnom for the stains that received in this world, so that it may enter Olam Haba and enjoy the radiance of Hashem's light. And everything goes measure for measure. That is to say, the punishments, there's a famous musical, Gilbert and Sullivan, the punishment suits the crime. Once the famous Jewish comedian Groucho Marx played the chief high executioner. He had a great time doing it. And he sang a song about how every time he meets things out, the punishment fits the crime. So here it says here, sins committed by passion, they need to be cleansed by the river Nahar, the river Dinar, which is a stream of fire. And sins committed through laziness, because you couldn't be bothered, or apathy, lack of interest, lack of emotion, are cleansed through Gehinnom of snow. Bottom of page 132. V'chein ha'oisek The Chokmas Umas Harlem. Now comes a big question. Every year the girls get very perturbed about this, and I don't blame them. It's a very serious issue because we are exposed to a whole culture that says if you don't go to college, you're never going to be good for anything. Our community here happens to have many very wealthy people who never went to college. They're just smart and bright, and they figured things out by themselves, and they became very wealthy. When I was growing up, there was I used to play golf, right? So I belonged to a golf club. There was a guy there, he was a multimillionaire. He was from Europe, multimillionaire. And he asked me, what was I doing with my life? I'm going to college. He says, oh, you're going to college. What are you studying? He says, his name was Willie Wagman. Willie Wagman, a little guy, sweet little guy. He says, what are you doing? He says, I'm studying English. He says, English? Why are you studying English? It's such an easy language. What do you have to study English for? It's such an easy language. So our culture says, because if you don't study, if you don't go to college and get a college degree, what are you going to be good for? To shine shoes. Even a job as a shoe shine boy, you won't be able to get. So a person, we go to college and we study all kinds of intellectual disciplines. That's what it says here. Chochmas umas ha'olam. We study the wisdom of the nations of the world just for its own sake. Okay. So this is considered here's the fasten your seatbelts, girls. These emotional seatbelts, your intellectual seatbelts. We're going to get a little shock now because the Alter Rebbe is going to say something that goes against American Western culture. I'm going to say that we've learned about Bittul Torah. A person has the capability of learning Torah and he doesn't use it. What about if a person studies science or music or literature or any of these things that we have studied, or history of the non-Jewish nations of the world, history of war, okay? This is considered the same as the person who had the ability to learn and didn't learn. That's called Bittul Torah, not learning when you could have learned. Bittul means, what does bittul mean? Bittul means not doing something, or bittul means the thing loses its identity. A drop of milk, you're preparing for Shabbos, and you have a big pot of cholent with meat or chicken in it, and you happen to have a yogurt, and you open the yogurt and it spritzes, and a drop flies out and lands in the cholent. Oy vey, now what are you going to do? Milk and meat. Now you got a big problem. So if there's no meat in there, you already took the meat out and all that's left is the soup. So you're better off because then there's a chance that maybe there's 60 times more soup than that one drop of milk. In which case the drop of milk is bottled. It loses its identity in the greater amount. Okay, so that's the meaning of the word bottle. It loses its identity. Now, bittul Torah means I could have learned Torah and I didn't. That means I was mevatel. I was mevatel the time I had to learn Torah. That's called bittul Torah. So a person who can learn and he doesn't learn, that's called bittul Torah. Okay, so he has to get kafakela, and then he has to go to the refrigerator to get cleansed for his coldness. So the freezing cold refrigerator will cleanse him from his coldness. There's a story about a guy, he really is a great tzaddik. Dubin, Mordechai Dubin, he was very smart. He was Hasidic. I don't know if he had a beard, but he definitely was Hasidic. He helped the previous Rebbe get out of the hands of the Germans. He saved his life. And when Germany invaded Latvia, he was a minister in the government. They arrested him. Or maybe he fell in the hands of the Russians. I don't know. They're both anti-Semites. And they put him in prison. And then one freezing winter's day, they suddenly told him that he was free to leave. He was free to leave prison. did he want to go? He said, yes. Can I have my clothes back? Because he was wearing prisoner's pajamas. He said, clothes? You want your clothes too? It's not enough for you to be free? You want your clothes? He said, no, it's okay. I'll go. And so they opened the door and they let him out. That was their joke. It was like 30 degrees below zero out. The ground was covered with snow, and he was going to freeze to death.
Oh, wow.
But if he stayed in jail, they would kill him in jail anyway. And in the end, that's what happened. He was arrested again. So you know the end of the story, he survived. But he was arrested again and he was shot. So he gave his life on Kiddush Hashem, which I never did. That's the greatest thing a person can possibly do. Rabbi Akiva prayed his whole life to have the merit to give his life for the sake of God. No mitzvah you do can come close to that. That's the greatest mitzvah a person could possibly do. But, you know, the Rebbe said in Basi Lagani, the first mimer, he said the difference between Rabbi Akiva and Avram Avinu is that Rabbi Akiva yearned for the day when he could give his life for the sake of God. He yearned for the day. So when the Romans came and they killed him for teaching Torah, they scoured his flesh with hot metal combs. They just peeled the flesh off of his body. And his Talmidim were screaming, and he was smiling. He says, for this, my whole life, I yearned for this. And he said, the sun began to rise. He said, Kriya Shema, and the sun went out. The holiness of Rabbi Akiva. And the Rebbe said, the difference between him and Avram Avinu was prepared for this, but he never looked for it. Never wanted it. If it had to be, so he was prepared for it, but he didn't yearn for it. His focus was only on serving God, not on acquiring any special merit for what he did, not even the merit of giving his life up for the name of God. So Mordechai Dubin gave up his life for the sanctifying the name of God. They let him out of prison, and it was freezing cold. He knew that he had to fight for his life now. So he saw in the distance, I don't know, a mile away, 2 miles away, sometimes in a dark night, we can see very far. He saw there was a light, and he started to run. In the freezing cold, he ran. If I don't run, I'm going to freeze. So he ran and ran and ran and ran and ran. How exhausted he must have been. I don't know. I couldn't have run 2 miles. And he came to this house, and it had a mezuzah. He came to houses, saw a house with a mezuzah, and he knocked on the door. Knocked. People were frightened. Knock on the door meant the police were coming to take you away, to arrest you. He knocked on the door. Someone looked out the window. They saw a prisoner. They didn't see a Jewish person. They saw a prisoner escaped from prison. They didn't open the door. And he collapsed on the doorstep, and he had no more energy. And he realized that the freezing cold, very soon, he's going to die. And then he thought to himself, they're going to wake up in the morning, they're going to find me dead on the doorstep. And they're going to be, the whole life, live with the regret of knowing that they could have saved my life and they didn't. And that's so terrible. So he summoned more energy and knocked on the door again and again and again, and they opened and they let him in and they saved his life. And he used to say that what really saved my life was Ahavas Yisrael, my love of another Jew, because what really saved him was just the thinking about the remorse that these people would feel for the rest of their life, that a Jewish person died because they wouldn't open the door. He couldn't allow himself the easiest thing to do would just be to lie there, and in a few minutes, he would stop feeling anything. People who've lived through this, they said, that's what happens. You just give up and you sit there, and all of a sudden you don't feel cold anymore. You feel warm, and then it's all over, unless someone saves you. So that's the idea of the Kinnim Shelig. A person who learns science, history, music, any of these subjects, just for its own sake, okay, with no thought of serving God. For instance, give you the other side. There was a guy, I knew him, I was very good friends with him. Chanabina says, how do you know so many people? Yitzchak Block. He was a brilliant student from Nashville, Tennessee. He grew up, was a good baseball player, a good basketball player. He was an all-around guy. His parents were traditional. They belonged to the synagogue, but they weren't, anything. And then the shliach came to town. And he started learning Hasidus with the shliach, and he became a fervent student of Hasidus. By this time, he was in college, and he was studying Greek philosophy. And the Rebbe told him he has to continue studying Greek philosophy. And the Rebbe made him a professor of Greek philosophy. You can read the story. Look, Google up his name, Yitzchak Block. It's a fascinating story. He passed away last year, and one of his grandchildren wrote a little booklet about 30 pages long about his life. And you'll see how the Rebbe made him into a professor of Greek philosophy. He wanted him there because on campus, he brought a lot of Jewish kids under the wings of the Shekhinah. He brought a lot of kids to Torah, to be observant of Torah Judaism, because he was a professor, and other academics that he met in his career as well. So there he used his knowledge of Greek philosophy for Torah. And that's different. If he hadn't done that, then it just would have been learning for the sake of Greek philosophy. And then it would have been just bittul Torah. It would have been just like anybody else, not using their abilities to learn Torah. So that's what he's saying here at the bottom of page 132, that if a person learns the knowledge of the nations, disciplines of the nations, he says, of the world, they are like engaging in inconsequential matters. Insofar as bittul Torah is concerned, page 133, as explained in the laws of Torah study, which is a very important part of the Shulchan Aruch. There are laws about keeping Shabbos. There are laws about studying Torah. And if you have the ability to study Torah and you don't, that's breaking the law of the mitzvah of learning Torah. And if you study science for its own sake, that comes into that category of a person who was guilty of bittul Torah. Now the Alter Rebbe goes even further, but there's a difference between bittul Torah, ordinary bittul Torah, like I'm interested in all the batting averages of all the baseball players and all the basketball stars, or I'm a fervent admirer of fashion and design. I figure girls are more interested in fashion and design than basketball and baseball. So let's say a person is very interested in design and really loves design and devotes herself to design. So that's also bittul Torah. A lot of men are designers, so they have the mitzvah of learning Torah more than women, because women are not responsible for any mitzvahs that are limited in time because of their family responsibilities. Okay, so we're just looking for examples here. We're comparing the difference between bittul Torah and a person who is guilty of bittul Torah because of his love for science. And the difference is, well, let me ask you, what do you think the difference would be? There's a huge difference between the two. What would it be? Sarah Cohen, you with me? What would be the difference between bittul Torah and a person who doesn't learn Torah because he loves science? He's interested in astrology, yes, astronomy. Wants to know how to calculate when the new moon will be seen. What's the difference?
The one who is in the bittul Torah has a tiny of he still have something connected with the Torah, but the one who study only the science has disconnected 100%.
No, you're getting too complicated here. A person who's just wastes his time with idle talk, so he contracts tumah from klippas noiga, but that tumah only affects his emotions. That's only tumah of the emotions, of the 7 emotions, right? Love, hate, beauty, victory, clarity, striving for clarity. communication. These are all things that we do because you only communicate because you feel for somebody else. Compassion, kindness, discipline, these are all emotions. So a person who just wastes his life and doesn't learn any Torah, he contaminates his emotions with the impurity of Klippas Noga. Okay, because he's only working with his emotions. He's not working with his brains. But a person who loves science, mathematics, geometry, physics, chemistry, musical theory, he's working with his brains. So he contaminates his Chochmah Bina Das with the klippa of Klippas Noiga, which is in these sciences, which is in these knowledges, these intellectual disciplines. So one klippa is entirely emotional. Your brains and your heart, this is today's or yesterday's or yom. Your intellect and your emotions are two worlds, two different worlds. Your intellect is cold and your heart is warm, passionate. So the person who just is guilty of ordinary wasting his time is contaminating his passions, his emotions, which could have been used to serve God. Instead, they're just being used for fashion or baseball scores. Whereas the scientist and the intellectual, because anybody could be interested in baseball scores or passion or design. But to be an actuary or to be an astronomer or to be a political analyst, you need to go to college. You need to develop your Chochmah Bina Das. You need to develop your intellectual activities, your intellectual side of you, your intellectual talents. And since you're using these for totally unholy purposes, not bad, just unholy, so they become contaminated, not with Shalosh Klippas Atameis, they become contaminated with Klippas Noiga, which is the neutral klippa, the in-between that could go up or could go down. Not like someone who uses his talents because he's a mafia guy and he plots the murder of his opponents and how to make more money smuggling drugs and pushing cocaine and heroin onto the streets. That's terrible. That's Shalosh Klippas Atameis. Here we're only talking about Klippas Noiga, the neutral klippa that could go up or could be holy or could be bad. Okay, so the scientific, the intellectual person contaminates his intellect with his intellectual interests that come from Klippas Noiga, because the passionate emotions that we use in our day-to-day life, these are accessible to every, shall we say, ignoramus, uneducated person. Anybody can get enthusiastic about baseball scores or fashion or politics, going to a rally, a political rally.
So,
Okay, so that's what it says, page 133. There now, Chana Bina, before Chana, this Chana, the other Chana had a question.
This topic is actually part of one of my assignments. So I want to ask a bit more questions.
Well, who gave you the assignment?
Rabbi Pape.
Oh, haha. Yes.
So you're saying that the high level scholarly stuff that you say university, that crowds Chochmah Bina Klippat Noga. But what if you're using it for the purpose of how there's some rabbis who need to know medical things to be a rabbi and like specifically medical stuff.
Or for instance, like we just been learning in the Rambam, right? The tribe of Yisachar were great scholars, great astronomers, and they taught the whole Jewish people because we need astronomy to fix the Jewish calendar. So they had to know when the new moon was going to appear, exactly when, which moment, and where it would be and which way it would be pointing and how much would be visible and what time of the evening would it first be visible. So they were honored beyond all people because the whole Jewish people depended on their scholarship. So there you are. You're just a few lines ahead.
But I have a couple more questions. You're mentioning about.
Okay, so I just want to say you're on the same page. You're exactly on, you're thinking right along the line. That's exactly the question that should be entering your mind at this point.
I now want to know about the opposite. Is there a way that people could go to college and learn high scholarly concepts and use their Chachma Dot, but instead it's not Klipat Noga, the Klipat Noga goes down, it goes to the impure levels. Is that possible?
Sure. Like should I give you a low life example? I had a teacher, and he used to talk to us about morals and ethics. Yeah. In the class, he taught us medieval English poetry, from the 1300s. Very interesting teacher and very demanding in the work. He used to say that, if you didn't really have the details straight, you couldn't get by with cotton wool, he said. Your essay is just full of cotton wool. It was very demanding. And then, not in my day, but I heard that after I left, I graduated. But he became very friendly with a certain group of students, very friendly. They made a party at the end of the year. And they invited him to the party, and they discovered him hiding in a closet with one of his students. So there, he used his knowledge to have influence on a student to do sin, to be sinful with a student. So then that schleps all his knowledge down into Shalosh Klippas Tameis. Because if he wasn't admired by the student, she wouldn't have gone with him. She wouldn't have been with him. He used that just to attract the student to have an improper relationship.
Thank you. Can you repeat the stuff about the
And you can make up your own variations on the same theme. I remember, yeah, yes.
Can you repeat what you were saying before about the emotional ones? Is that for when you study things that aren't high intellect and more just passion?
Well, because anything you do with feeling. You don't do anything without feeling. Anything that you're going to do in your life, this goes back to chapter 3. Anything you're going to do in your life, you're going to do because you feel for it. With your brains, you don't feel. With your brains, you think. The world of the intellect is cool. That's what it says in Hayem Yem from yesterday. It says very clearly that the world of intellect and the world of feeling are two different worlds. So it defines it very clearly. Here we go. See there? That the back should be the yin yang. Here we go. Yes. Okay. Gimel Shvat. This is the first book the Rebbe wrote. When a person studies literature, he's going to want to find out what was the first thing that my author wrote. So it wasn't yesterday. It was the 12th day of Shvat. It was 3 days ago. Haseichel, his pilos, emotion, intellect, and emotions, being excited about something. Shnei olam meisem are two different worlds. Olam kar u'miyushav, the intellect is cool and calm. Think of Olam reiseyach, and the world of passions is boiling and excited, full of excitement. And this is what our job as human beings is to connect these two things. That they should be not separate worlds, they should be unified. So then the excitement becomes channeled into what you do, to make the things that you do full of energy and life and warmth. And the seichel, l'moira deren, and the seichel becomes the guide, a guide in life of service, of effective service of God. So there you are.
So what would you say about, let's talk about me before I dropped out of university. I went to study commerce because I loved math and accounting and all that stuff. It really excited me. And
Really?
I thought that I would become an actuary or something and make a lot of money and have a good time.
So what did you love more, the math or the money?
But the idea of doing something I enjoyed that is also prestigious would get me a lot of money. That appealed to me. But what if I were now, like I dropped out and I don't want to do this stuff anymore, but that's a mixture of passion and intellect. So
Yeah.
Isn't that connecting then?
Yes.
But
yes,
it's
but
not
the intellect,
easy
the intellect will guide you to use all those inclinations in the service of Hashem, like we're going to find out in another few lines.
Quick question about that. Just can you tell about the Bittul Torah? Again, the difference of the one who has the Bittul Torah has an infection in his can infect his emotion or his feeling.
Bittul Torah, what? I don't hear you clear.
What did you say? What did you say about Bittul Torah? The one who is who can learn the Torah.
A person can learn Torah.
But he does science.
Oh, but he does science?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there his intellect becomes contaminated with the klippa that's in the sciences. Now you're going to ask the question, why do we say that there's klippa in the sciences? So he's going to explain that next, but we're at the end of the class now. He's going to have to explain that. What is klippa doing? Now he's going to have to explain why do we say that the sciences are contaminated with klippa? And does that have to be totally negative? Can't it be positive? That's Hanabina's question. So the answer is yes, of course it can be positive if you use that knowledge for a holy purpose. And he gives you examples. One is to earn a living. Why do you have to earn a living, Hanabina? Why do you need to have a lot of money?
To send your kids to a good religious school and be able to afford all the expenses that
To afford the tuition, which is immense. Do you know how much people they charge here in Flatbush? $15,000, $20,000, $25,000 a year for a child. What does a family do who has 8 children? Do the arithmetic. What is it, Hanabina? 8 times 25, $200,000. $200,000 just to pay tuition. So you got to have a job where you're earning more than $1 million a year to pay the tuition. Or to live in a Jewish community. I know people left Crown Heights because they couldn't afford to buy a house and they moved to Long Island where it was cheaper. Or they moved to Pittsburgh, or they moved to Buffalo or Syracuse, where you can get a house for a fraction of the price. Or Florida, lots of places in Florida, very, very inexpensive, nice nice climate, nice place to live. Okay, so you have to earn, you use your intellect to earn money to live a Jewish life and to educate your children and to pay for their chasanas and the simchas. Okay, or he takes it even further. If a person uses his intellect in order to fight for Judaism, to fight missionaries. And we find that great scholars like Maimonides and Nachmanides, they did that, and their students. They engaged in debates with clerics. And the previous Rebbe tells a story from the times even before the Alter Rebbe, from the times of the Baal Shem Tov. One of the Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov was a shoemaker. And people didn't realize he was in fact a deep scholar and makubal, a mystic. And when the local priest wanted to earn himself a place in heaven by converting Jews to Christianity, if anybody could counter his arguments, nobody was able to argue against him. So this cobbler stood up and refuted all his arguments. So then he was arrested and he was hauled off he had to engage in public disputations with the hierarchy of the church. And when he defeated them in the debates, they killed him. He gave his life on Kiddush Hashem, another example of how a person uses his intellect for holiness.
This one should be. Thank you. This is one of the